Hi and welcome back to my channel and welcome to my Halloween Spooktacular series. Now I am attempting to do the 13 Days of Halloween collaboration with Nerd Goblin Art. I will pop the link in the description as always and at the end of the video, so take a look at the playlist. This is also a special one for me as 1st of October is my birthday, so I'm wondering if you can guess how old I am today. Be kind, because it is my birthday. So we're kicking the series off with these Spooktacular shaker moulds. So this is a 2-for-1 video as there is a surprise shaker after these. So I've mixed up my resin. The resin I use is the craft resin. These moulds are in fact small enough to be able to do them with UV resin, but one, it would take an awful lot, and two, the finish on them is much nicer with epoxy. So as you can see, I'm just pouring in clear resin into these moulds, and my idea is to pop some alcohol inks into them. I've made these shaker moulds in the past with neons and solid micas, but never with alcohol inks, so we thought, right, we'll give it a go. So I'm just going round with my stick, making sure there's no air pockets. For the two ghosts, I've mixed up some resin with some white neon powder from Let's Resin. Now you have got to give this a good mix because, as I've said in other videos, the neon powders can be quite gritty, but they are fabulous. Not glow in the dark, mind, just neon, which I found out whilst making this video. Although they shine and glow under a UV light, they are not glow in the dark. Now I did want both ghosts completely white, but I had a bit of an accident with the neon orange paste. So this one ended up with some orange splodges, splats in it. So I'm just doing exactly the same as I did with the clear. I'm not the tidiest of people, making sure that it's completely covered. Now, even though I've used this mould before, what I didn't realise is that some of them have a raised part, and I think it's to pop in the glycerin or the liquid that you're using. So one or two of them ended up leaking from the back, but luckily enough I'd coated most of them with UV resin before I demoulded them. So after filling the other ghost with the white, these are some metallic alcohol inks. Now I've had these quite a while, and because they tend to take over, I was a bit concerned about using them, but these ones weren't too bad. The outcome wasn't great. I think they muddied a little bit, but you can see there's some neon ones and some metallic ones, so I just thought, chuck it all in. I then went back in with the original orange because they had shrunk, and then decided to use the black metallic alcohol ink, again from the same pack. So I'm just popping a couple of drops of black in each because, again, I didn't want them to take over. And I know in particular the silver and the gold really do, but I just kept adding the inks. As you will know if you've seen most of my videos, I just don't know when to stop. So why would this project be any different? So I just kept dropping more and more inks in. There wasn't enough black, so I then popped a little bit more black, and then a little bit more orange, and then a little bit more black again. And I think if I'd have left it 10 steps before this, they probably would have looked really good. Or even if I'd have left it there, but I decided to go in with the Let's Resin Sinker White and see what that did. Now it was only whilst doing this that I realised that the moulds were that shallow that there was nowhere for the ink to sink to. But still continued anyway. And then just for good measure thought, do you know what? I'll stick a little bit more in. And trust me when I say, yeah, it was too much. Way too much in these shallow moulds. So after popping one final layer of the Sinker White in, I left them to cure. So these were too big for my curing machine, and they looked quite good from the top. It was when I demoulded them that they weren't so good. Yeah, you can see. I mean, there was a sort of colour separation to some of them, but they'd sort of muddied and weren't as vibrant as I wanted them to be. But I thought we'll continue and do some of the detail. and see what they look like with some sparkly bits inside. Now this one I kind of liked because I liked the clear bit in it. And you can see here, this is where I had the accident with the orange neon. A lesson to be learnt in not opening micas over your moulds. And with this one, I'd even forgotten that there was resin in there. So last minute, I just put some spooky Halloween glitter into it. And this is the other white one. On this mould as well comes these little tiny pieces. Now the point of these are to pop inside the shakers. So I have used some UV resin just to fill these up, various different colours, purples and blacks and glitter, etc., to pop inside the shakers. Now it was time to do the little features. So for this I'm using the Let's Resin Neon Orange powder and some UV resin. I'm using my usual resin, which is the J. Diction, the high viscosity this time, purely because I want it to be quite thick, because I don't want it to run anywhere else other than the eyes and the mouth. And after giving it a good stir with my stick, I'm then popping it into the little grooves and gaps that are already there for his eyes and mouth. Now I do this for all of them, and I'll speed this bit up for you. Now this did take a minute. This is 19 times sped up. So yeah, I'm just continuing to get in all the little gaps and groove for every one of them. And at this point, I'm actually quite starting to like them. After I filled them all with the UV, I pop them under my lamp to cure. And this is how they're looking so far. So I thought I'd close the gap up on the ghost with the eyes, but I didn't see the hole on the bottom of the other ghost on its tail. So that was the one that ended up leaking, which I was gutted about. So now it's time to turn them into shakers, and for this I've got little pieces of acetate and I'm just drawing round the outside edge of these shakers. So I'll show you two, and I ended up doing the rest off camera as this video was already becoming a little bit long. So after I drew around the outside edge, I then cut it out. Now, don't worry about using a marker pen on this acetate, because the good thing is that once you've cut it out, if there's still black marker on there, you just get a bit of alcohol and wipe it off. This can be a bit fiddly to get it exact, because what you need is for there to be good contact between the acetate and your shaker mould itself. So you can see here, I'm just cleaning the rest of the pen off with a little bit of alcohol and making sure that there's no fingerprints at all on the acetate. Trust me, if there's loads of fingerprints on the acetate, you can clearly see them when the shaker's finished, and nobody wants that. So after cutting these out, I'm just making sure that they fit perfectly onto the front of these moulds. Now it was time to give them a bit of sparkle. So for this, I start off by using some little cute pumpkins that I've had since last Halloween, and I'm just popping a couple of them into each of the moulds. I then decided to raid my stash of glitters for the Halloween-y type of glitter looking ones that I had. So I decided on a mixture of all these. So all I did was pop a little bit of each of the glitters into a little pot and just give it a little bit of a stir. I spent weeks organising my glitters and popping them on little shelves, and all in little bottles in order of colour. I know, sad really. So after mixing this concoction up and then giving a bit of a stir, it was time to fill up the shaker moulds. Now there are two ways of doing this. One is probably safer than the other. So the more risky way is to tip the glitter into the mould itself and then pour the liquid into it before then popping the acetate over the top. Now you can use a mixture of glycerin and oil, I think it is, of some sort, but I'm using baby oil for this, and I'm just pouring it on top of the glitter. Now the risky thing about this is that if you get any of that oil around the edge, your UV isn't going to stick, therefore your acetate isn't going to stick and it's going to leak. So I have them on my levelling table and I'm just making sure there's nothing around the edge, and I get my UV resin and just put a line all the way round. Like I say, very risky. The slightest movement and there's oil in that resin. I then really carefully grab my acetate and pop it on top. Now, rather than just curing this with my UV lamp, you need to make sure that there is absolute contact with the mould and the acetate itself. So after getting it in position, I then get a cotton wool bud and ever so carefully, not to tilt it, press down all around where the UV is, making sure that there's really close contact before I pop it underneath my lamp. Again, like I keep saying, risky. So after going all the way around this mould, I then pop it under my UV lamp for 3 minutes. Whilst it's under my lamp, I like to get my cotton wool bud and just press it down firmly again, just to make doubly sure that that contact is there. Now, I wasn't going to show you the entire process of me doing them all, but as you can see, that one was the only one that leaked because it come out of the hole, which I can only assume is for popping the liquid in. So these are them after I've popped the acetate on them. I mean, like I say, it did take a while, but I managed to rescue all bar one, and I think they are really, really cute. So I did find in order to finish these off, it was best to put a top coat of UV resin over the front of the acetate, just to make sure that the front of it is actually solid and not bendy, and that the liquid doesn't come out of the edges in any way, shape or form, or that the acetate doesn't bend then to break it. So I am using the craft resin, UV resin for this. I'm spreading it right towards the edge. Now, resin will never go where resin's never been. So as long as you don't create a channel for that resin to come off the edge, you can push it right the way to the edge and it won't come off. Now, I always find when using UV for top coats, if you get a torch or a light of some sort and you shine it on the piece, you can see whether the UV resin's gone right to the edge or not. So after finishing top coating them all, I then pop them under the UV light to dry. Now, you need to be careful that there's no baby oil on the top before you top coat them, otherwise they end up sticky. I will pop up proper pictures at the end. So the next one we're going to do is a different kind of shaker. And I've not seen anybody using a technique like this. Now, this is a technique that I discovered while creating the video linked in the card above. So the reason I'm turning this silicone cup inside out is that it doesn't have that rim on the bottom, which showed up in the original coaster that I did this with. So I'm just giving the cup a clean and making sure there are no marks on it. And then I'm pouring a little bit of resin into the bottom of this skull mould. Now, this resin has been through my debubbler because I need this to be as crystal clear as possible. And then I'm popping my silicone cup inside the uncured resin and pushing down so that it's nearly touching the bottom. Now, this cup actually fit quite snug, so it wasn't going anywhere. And then I continue to fill the skull up to about his eyes. Now, in hindsight, what I should have done was colour the resin with some clear resin pigment and then fill it up completely. But hindsight's a wonderful thing. So I popped it into my curing machine, and now this is fully cured and it's time to take the cup out of the mould. Now, because the silicone cup is a matte silicone, this has left this matte, but there's an easy way to solve that. So I just get some UV resin on the end of my glove and just run it round the bottom of this piece. Now, unfortunately, my camera just chose not to film that bit. Now, like I said, I would have preferred this to have been colour with a clear ball in the middle, and I have figured out a way to do that. So after I popped my shakery bits in and mixed up my range of glitters that I used earlier, it was now time to cut out the acetate to stick on the top of this shaker. In order to fill this shaker up, I'll be showing you the second technique that I was on about earlier, which is the much safer option. So in order to make sure that I've got the right size acetate to go over the top, I'm just drawing around the cup that made the hole in the first place. Again, drawing around the outside so I'm able to cut around the middle. Because this was a bit of a disastrous circle, I got a cotton wool bud and just cleaned off the acrylic marker in order to make the right size shape. I then used the scissors to cut around it and then tried to see if it would fit. Now, the issue here is because I've only filled it halfway, it's left like a lip around the edge, and I was worried that the acetate wasn't going to stick to it properly and it was going to leak. I'd only filled it halfway because I wanted at least some sort of colour to it, not to be completely clear, But if I'd have used clear resin dye, I would have been able to do that anyway, because you'd have still been able to see the bits move inside. So if there's anyone that wants to try and give this a go, that's a little bit of a tip. If you use a coloured pigment, you can then fill it up near enough to the top. You're always going to need to leave a lip at least so that you can cover to make sure that it's completely leak free. So after putting the glitters that I want in there, I'm just popping enough so that it'll shake about. I'm now attaching the acetate to the top of this hole. So after pondering for a while on the best way to do this, I decided on popping some UV resin around the edge of the acetate. Once I've got a small layer all the way round, I then pop it into the skull on top of this hole, making sure that it's completely covering it. And then give it a real good push down to make sure that it's really secure and that it has complete contact with the resin beneath. Now you'll notice we still haven't put the liquid in, but we will get to that in a bit. So after making sure it was completely secure, I then cured it with my UV lamp, while still giving it a push down to make sure that it was real close contact. The last thing I needed was this thing leaking once there was resin there. So after popping it under my light for a good 6 minutes, I decided to go round the edge a few times with the UV resin and then cure that, just to make sure that it was absolutely fully sealed. Now it was time to pop the liquid in, but again, in true Tony fashion, the footage just isn't there. I captured 3 seconds of it. So I'm going to show you the second technique with this shaker instead. So I've got myself a pin and I'm literally piercing through the acetate. And then I've got a 2mm needle and with a 2mm syringe that's already been filled with baby oil. There we go. And then we are going to fill it with the needle and syringe. Now this way you don't get any air bubbles in it. But the reason I didn't do it this way was purely because I've used my needle that much that I need to get some more. So all it was doing was making bubbles inside the piece. So it's not coming out too quick at the minute, and it took forever, honestly. I mean, look, it's barely dripping. So you can imagine how long it took me to fill up that cavity in the skull. There must have been, or what I thought, was 45 minutes worth of footage. So anyway, after filling up the skull with the liquid, it was time for the next layer of resin. But just before I did that, I went round all the edges once again with the UV resin, just to triply make sure that we weren't going to have any leakages. So after giving it a bit of a push around with my stick, I then cure that again for the final time. But made a massive rookie mistake. I forgot to clean off the acetate before I poured the next layer of resin. So after giving it one last final cure, it was time for the next layer of resin. So I mixed my resin up, I popped it in my debubbler, and then I poured it into the piece. Now I thought I'd keep in keeping with the rest of the video and use alcohol inks to finish this off. I didn't want to detract from the shaker, but I didn't want a perfectly clear piece either. Which is why when I say I should have used resin dye, it would have been a much safer and easier option. The problem with alcohol inks in these skulls is that you just can't tell how much zinkage there is. I've had some absolutely stunning results with alcohol inks and skulls, but then I've had some that are just, well, completely, there. Now it was time to finish it off with the alcohol inks. So the colours I was using are the blues, the purple and the orange. Again, Tone, know when to stop. Because this was giving a really good colour combination until I had to keep going and going and going. I was even using my colour codes and my splitter inks. And then it's just like somebody else takes over and has to just keep messing. But do you remember me saying I hadn't cleaned the top off? And on putting the first couple of layers of ink, I realised they were separating because of the oil underneath. So while popping all these colours on, I'm thinking to myself, is this actually going to cure with the oil inside it? But I was already invested, so I thought my best bet is to pop it in the curing machine and wait for it to cure. So after running my stick along the underneath edge to make sure there's no air bubbles underneath, popped it in my curing machine for a few hours, Then it was time to demould. But first I thought I'd leave you with these dancing inks. Absolutely stunning. Luckily enough, this fully cured, but it did have like a residue on the top, an oily residue, so I was starting to think that maybe it was leaking. But on the plus side, it made it easier to demould. But look at the outcome. I was actually quite pleased. Not so happy with the colour, but it's got that dark Halloween vibe to it. So this has been part of the 13-day collaboration with Nerd Goblin Art. So I'll leave you with some glamour photos. I've been Tony from Georgiesgorgeousgifts. Stay safe, happy crafting, and bye for now.
Shadows stretch and start to crawl. Moonlight whispers down the hall. A cauldron bubbles, it's calling me to craft some chills for all to see. Wicked creations, spooky sensations, Georgie's gifts so gory, horror spinning, reasons grinning, Tony's tricks for Halloween glory. Ghosts are trapped in resin frames, skulls that grin.